It's great to welcome to the program today Cailin O'Connor, who's a philosopher and mathematician, as well as an associate professor at UC Irvine and author of the book, The Misinformation Age. Cailin, it's so great to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, David.
So I think to start with, when we think about the way that misinformation spreads, I've read opinions or pieces that say we need to think about it almost like a virus spreads. Others who talk about other sort of analogies that can be used. When we just broadly start to think about how misinformation spreads, and we can include in misinformation actual fake news, not the definition that the current president sometimes applies, but like actual fake news. Conspiracy theories fall under this. Whatever types of information we want to talk about, what is the general way we should be thinking about how these spread through society?
Yeah, so misinformation is such a broad topic, and I should say some misinformation is not like other misinformation.
Yes.
But one useful way people have modeled this is literally using models from epidemiology. So, models intended to understand how literal viruses go from person to person to person, like two people meet, and then there's some chance the virus spreads. So the analogy would be that two people meet, and then there's some chance that an idea or misinformation spreads from person to person. Part of the reason I think this is so important to understand is that in the middle of this crisis of misinformation, false belief, fake news, a lot of people have tried to understand, okay, what goes wrong with human reasoning? Why are humans so bad at figuring out what's true about the world? And I think that a better perspective is to ask, what kind of social environments are we in, and how do these allow this kind of misinformation and false beliefs to spread?
Yeah, along those lines, the average person, when we hear something that we've either not heard before and we have to assess the truth or falsity of it, or we hear something that contradicts a pre-existing belief, it seems that there's a number of levels on which we're evaluating what we're hearing. And part of that is the content itself. Part of it is the context. And context, of course, includes some kind of assessment of the trustworthiness of where we are hearing the information. Let's start with that piece first. What do we know about how the average person is assessing what is considered trustworthy as a source, be it as an individual person or a news network or publication? What's the process that we go through?
Yeah, good. So there seem to be a lot of things that go into people's assessment of like, okay, I've heard from something from this source. Do I trust that source? And some of these things are really good things. So if someone has lied to us or misinformed us before, we're less likely to trust them this time.
Yes.
And that's smart. If we know that some news source has a really good reputation, sometimes we're more likely to trust them, and that's smart. But then we also have all of these kind of psychological little tricks and rules for how we trust people that don't necessarily do good things for us when it comes to false belief. So, for example, we just trust people who we judge to be more like us. And that could be they're my same gender or race, or they're also in my football club. And those things don't actually guide us towards people who are better at sharing false or better at sharing true beliefs or helping us develop good beliefs.
Are there ways in which the understanding that we have and that institutions and corporations and governments have in how we are making these assessments can sort of be used against individuals to make them more likely to believe something that is not true?
Oh, so people's understanding of these facts about our sort of social psychology and the way we update beliefs. Yeah. So one thing that we should all understand is that what we might call broadly propaganda. So people who have some stake in getting us to believe something and who are trying to get us to believe things, and this could be industry, it could be different government bodies, it could be political parties, it could be Russian agents. These influence groups often are very savvy to the ways in which we are social learners and our knowledge is deeply social. So if you look, just to give an example, at Russian disinformation, it's often designed to, so they'll design some meme in such a way that they know people are going to be sharing it from person to person with those they trust. And they know that what's going to happen is they're not going to be the source of that information to others. Instead, everyone's going to see it from someone who's their friend or their family member. And so they design it in a way to take advantage of this fact that we tend to trust the people we know and love and think are somehow similar to us.
That's interesting. So it seems that with that, there's probably also some social status component in terms of the people that are replicating the idea, maybe. I mean, I can imagine, a simple example would be you happen to live in a part of the country that has a significant anti-vaccine community, as an example. And so merely for sort of social acceptance and social status reasons, you become more likely to replicate those ideas. Is that to some degree something you've observed?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So many people call this conformity bias. So the underlying psychological thing is that it's uncomfortable for people to stick out from the pack. We like being like other people. And as you pointed out, we in particular like to mimic or conform with people who we consider to be high status, who have a lot of power or a lot of money, or we think they're cool, or we just really like them and everyone else likes them. And you also see a lot of misinformation campaigns taking advantage of that. So, for example, anti-vaxxers who get celebrities to scare everyone about vaccines are taking advantage of this kind of bias towards conformity, and especially the fact that we like to conform with these high status people.
I get the sense that there's some feedback loop here between the spread of misinformation and political polarization in the United States, but I'm not sure where the circle starts. So if you look at, for example, what Jonathan Haidt has written about, he might argue that the political polarization is coming as a sort of effect more than a cause in some of these cycles. But I could sort of think about it either way. I mean, we could see that for other reasons, there's more polarization, and this primes people to be more likely to accept misinformation. You could also think about it the other way, which is that for non-political reasons, misinformation is spreading more easily, technological reasons, social media, whatever, and that therefore is increasing political polarization. Is it a one-way thing, one way or the other, or is it more of a persistent feedback loop?
When it comes to polarization, I mean, untangling this knot of what is happening and why, I think is really complicated. So one thing that my co-author and I argue in the Misinformation Age, and we sort of use mathematical models to do this, is that there are different things that can cause polarization. So in some ways, it's almost overdetermined that you can get feedback loops based on social trust. So we don't trust people who have different beliefs than us. And so once beliefs start pulling apart in these polarized communities, we don't trust the evidence coming from them. They don't trust it coming from us. And suddenly you have stable polarization. Conformity that I was talking about before can lead to polarization too. We're all conforming in some clique in a social network. Other people are conforming. And because we have these different social pressures, we won't trust or we won't uptake the kind of information or ideas coming from another group. So that can cause polarization. Just listening to different news sources so that you have different groups in a community, just getting different sources of information can also cause polarization because then they're just not sharing ideas with each other. It's such a deep, complicated thing. And then as you point out, there are these things where we see, for example, Russian agents promoting polarization in the US, but also taking advantage of all that anger and emotion and hatred to spread their own stories in a really effective way. I mean, as you point out, it's complicated.
How important in all of this is individual psychology? Because some of what I've read suggests that, if you could look at studies that say, well, American conservatives tend to have larger fear centers in their brains, as an example, so that there's actually something going on at the neurological level that might predispose someone to be more or less likely to buy into or question beliefs or whatever the case may be. In this broader context that you study misinformation, how relevant is individual psychology?
Well, so there are so many parts of individual psychology, but the particular thing you're talking about where there's some idea that, conservative and liberals have different genes or different emotional responses, I tend to think probably isn't that important of an explanatory factor of things like polarization and belief. So you might call that almost like a common cause explanation for ideology. Like there are certain types of people who are going to be prone to different types of ideas. But I think if you look at what ideas end up glomming into conservative and liberal, often they're really random. And what we argue is that probably it has a lot more to do with our social psychology, that holding certain beliefs ends up being a symbol or a signal that you're part of a group. And then these beliefs end up glomming together and becoming part of a meaningful group identity. So there are a bunch of beliefs that are part of conservative identity or part of a liberal identity. And it's more about group membership and maintaining that than about just having been innately different to begin with, is what we think.
What do we know about the most effective ways to disabuse people of false beliefs? If you look at, for example, the work of Daniel Kahneman, he says we might think that if you just beat people over the head with the facts, they'll just see that their beliefs are wrong and they'll change their mind. But in fact, it sort of seems like the opposite often happens. What does seem to be effective at getting people out of false beliefs?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on what kind of belief you're talking about because there's so many different kinds of beliefs. So for some of them, it is effective just to give people the facts. Like if you are looking at a spider and you're like, oh yeah, those spiders are harmless. And I'm like, no, trust me. I am a spider scientist and that is a poisonous spider. It's very easy to change your false belief in that case. That belief isn't really tied into a lot of your ideology. It's not part of your core identity. It's not part of your signals of in-group membership and things like that. Other beliefs, like, regulating guns will save people's lives, are much more tied into people's group membership and identity. So polarized beliefs tend to be the ones that get to be really hard to change. One thing that seems to be effective is using these kinds of little tricky trust rules we all use to try to rehabilitate groups that have false beliefs. So if you look at some group that has high levels of anti-vaxxing, so recently the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn has had high levels of anti-vaxxing. Just going in as a doctor who's not part of that community, who people don't know, who they don't trust, and saying like, look, dummies, here's all the evidence, isn't going to be effective. But if you have someone who is part of that community who can say like, look, we share a lot of values. I'm like you. I understand where you're coming from. Here's why I think you're wrong, can be much more effective. So we need ways to communicate that take advantage of the ways humans build trust with each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm imagining there are situations where it's hard to find someone who's part of the group. I mean, fundamentally, sometimes you're dealing in conversations that are happening only between people who are not part of the same group. Are those inherently the most difficult situations to make progress in?
Yeah, I mean, if you are part of two different groups and there isn't a lot of shared trust, it can be extremely difficult to make progress and, get to someone. I mean, one thing that, as you were saying, like sometimes trying to have these conversations or share information in this way with someone who has a bad belief can actually go the opposite direction. It can push them away from the good belief and push them away from you. There's been some evidence that, as much as you can, if you can create trust, connection, like a personal connection with someone, it's a more effective way to spread information than like sending studies and yelling at people and being like, you're so dumb.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because I've interviewed a lot of former extremists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, etc. And the trend about what eventually pulled you out and what would have prevented you from getting sucked in the first place is people who expressed empathy towards me, people who connected with me, people who participated in what would be called sort of a community with me, would be the biggest kind of like de-radicalizing factor, and seems to have been. And there definitely seems to be something analogous between that and what you're saying.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
The book is The Misinformation Age. We've been speaking with the book's author, Cailin O'Connor, who is an associate professor at UC Irvine. Cailin, so great to talk to you. I really appreciate your time today.
And I'll just mention I have a co-author, James Owen Weatherall, who's also here at UC Irvine.
Yes, co-author, I should say. We never want to forget that two people wrote the book. And we will link to it with both author names, by the way, on our website at davidpakman.com/recommendations. Cailin, really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks for talking, David.